The New York Society for Ethical Culture, Joe Schuman, who is not only a leader here, he is one of the longest standing leaders in the ethical movement today. So I hope he's sitting down. And he has been a leader for over 40 years. So we're delighted to have him. He's also a professor at Columbia University, at Hunter College, teaching human rights and allied matters. And today is the second Sunday of the month. So you can mark your calendar. That is Joe's Day. And he's going to be speaking to us about rebuilding the future of America. So tell us, Joe.
Okay.
Tell us about that.
Thank you so very much for the warm introduction, Richard. It's so great to be with everyone at the beginning of the new season, at the beginning of fall. It's also, of course, the Jewish New Year, when, according to Jewish tradition, God began the creation of the world. So this is a day for, in effect, notable beginnings. It's so good to be with you. Actually, I should say, Richard, I've been a leader for over 50 years, so it's beginning to feel like a career, I should say. I also want to say a word about the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think we all wish that she would have gone on forever. She was incredibly hardworking and devoted to her work and to the law. And she truly is a transitional figure. When she started Harvard Law School many years ago, she was one of only 9 female students in the class. There wasn't a single woman who was teaching on the faculty of Harvard Law. And she entered a world in which male dominance prevailed in the professions, in the workplace generally, and of course in society. And as a result of her work using the courts and using law, she really not only changed the law, but transformed society. She appealed to the Constitution and its mandate for equal protection, and applied it in ways in which it had not been applied before, and that was to apply it to the status of women. And so today we live in a much different world. Some scholars have said, I think correctly, that she was in the world of women's rights, in some ways the analog to what Thurgood Marshall was in the area of enhancing the rights of blacks, that is, using the courts and the law to leverage those changes. So she truly was a pivotal figure, and of course ethical culture has long been committed to women's rights, the equality of women, the right to an abortion, reproductive freedom, and so forth. So she was truly an ally, and I think in many ways a humanist. So it's a great loss for us. But I want to talk this morning in a more positive vein. I want to talk really about resilience, and my talk comes in 2 parts. The first part deals with resilience on the personal level, and the second deals with what we might call social resilience, and looking for areas in our culture, in our society, in our politics, where we might be able to engender hope in these very trying and, I would say, ominous times. So let me begin by saying we are in a time that cries out for hope. It's a time also which calls upon us to be personally resilient. My talk this morning is devoted to restoring our hope, but also in sustaining our resilience as individuals and summoning the resilience of society as a whole. There has been much discussion of late in psychological circles about the power of resilience. Since the 1970s, it's been a subject of scientific examination. What is resilience? Without being too technical, we can define resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relational problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. There are many other stressors that are not included in this definition that I think are very relevant to our moment. They are daunting challenges that emerge from the circumstances that we're in. They are so imposing that they need not even be mentioned, but I will. The coronavirus pandemic is perhaps the most pervasive and oppressive of all. It is a unique and extraordinary phenomenon, totally outside of our normal and familiar experience. The stress it brings arises in great measure from the ambiguity that comes with it. We don't know whether we ourselves will fall ill or our loved ones will. In this country, if not in our immediate region, at least for the time being, it feels like it's out of control. And of course, its uncertainty is tagged to the fact that we don't know when it will end. Added to the ambiguity of this disease is its strange and idiosyncratic character, affecting different people in different ways. Some people have no symptoms at all. Some have mild symptoms, but they last for a long time. Some suffer severe symptoms that cause lasting damage. And still others can feel moderately ill for a week, wake up in the morning feeling that way, and end up on a ventilator in the evening. The virus constricts and contorts our lives. We all need to be cautious and vigilant, lest we catch the disease or communicate it to others. And as we know, the need for personal distancing, which comes unnaturally for us as social creatures, cuts off warm, engaged, intimate relationships with other human beings. It brings upon us the stress of isolation and loneliness. And Zoom, I believe, is no substitute for being in the felt presence of other human beings. It is no surprise that depression is on the rise in American society. Michelle Obama herself reports that she is among the depressed. And then there are the economic realities. Our economy is in ruins. Though if truth be told, the pandemic has brought into stark relief economic realities that were in fact long present before the emergence of COVID-19. Before the plague hit, 40% of all Americans had trouble meeting their monthly bills, and 40% had less than $400 in savings. With the pandemic, these realities have become unmasked, and millions of people have fallen or are about to fall over the precipice. With evictions looming, with a massive loss of jobs, and with it health insurance tagged to those jobs, with multitudes suffering the humiliation of waiting on long lines at food banks so their children don't go hungry, the cumulative worry and anxiety in American society must be beyond calculation. The pandemic has divided our society into two separate populations, the privileged and the unprivileged. The privileged are those who still have jobs and have the luxury of working from home. The unprivileged are those who have lost their jobs or who must work in environments in which they put themselves at risk. And I count among those who are stressed parents of school children. Whether their children can attend school or must engage in stay-at-home online learning, all of this is in a state of flux, if not chaos, not only for parents and their children, but for teachers, administrators, and other school personnel. For those of us who are relatively secure, I never quite know whether concern for those who have fallen over the precipice is a function of compassion or is patronizing. I feel like I am standing on the shore, gazing over the ocean and watching my fellow human beings drown, and I am powerless to save them. This despair adds to the stress, even from a privileged standpoint. And as we all know, we are in a state of social upheaval. The murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police in May has inspired mass protests around the country, not only condemning the murder of African-American men at the hands of the police, but have probed much further into deep-rooted and systemic racism that permeates every stratum of American society, the economy, education, housing, healthcare, the criminal justice system, and much more. These events rivet our immediate attention, but forever looming is the menace of climate destruction. Oregon is ablaze with wildfires that are simply unprecedented. I personally have family in Oregon and Corvallis who cannot walk out their front door because the air is too acrid to safely breathe. On the West Coast, forest fires have now consumed territory as large as my state of New Jersey, and many are still out of control. As Governor Newsom has said, for those who deny climate change, let them come to California. And last but not least, we have a presidential election looming in the next several weeks. It is arguably the most consequential in at least 150 years, for it may determine whether the United States will endure as a democracy or whether the American experiment after 244 years will fall into illiberalism and come to an end. One is not supposed to take partisan positions from the ethical culture platform. But I would argue that what is at stake in the coming election transcends political partisanship. It is not a question of whether one favors the Democratic or Republican Party, or this policy or that, but reaches far more deeply to touch the level of fundamental norms on which the very structure of our nation is built. Not only does the current occupant of the White House, in his gross incompetence, ignorance, mental derangement, and pathological mendacity, force us to live in an Alice in Wonderland reality, an alternative universe which in its assault on truth renders us all more insecure in the moment, he lays out the possibility of a future for our society in which democracy will very well be shredded. And even beyond, when the President of the United States, with all his authority, feeds into nutty conspiracy theories that are gaining a foothold in mainline politics, the rational moorings which anchor reality are thrown into confusion, and the underpinnings of a rational and ultimately functional society are distorted and eroded. I don't want my grandchildren to live in that territory. The sum of all these assaults coming at us at the same time takes its psychological and emotional toll and imposes upon us a great need for coping. Indeed, every day, and in some sense all the time. Speaking personally, I know it does for me. It forces me to turn inward, to dig deeper and try to summon up greater resilience to keep my emotional head above the waterline. And so I've developed several basic, simple strategies by which to summon my resilience and by which to cope and get through the day without falling into dysfunction and despair. And speaking personally, it's a constant struggle that involves engaging several conscious strategies, which I'd like to just briefly share with you. In the capacity for resilience, is the capacity, I should say, for resilience something that is genetically endowed and inborn, or is it something that can be cultivated? I suspect it's a product of both, but whether we have little or more capacity to be resilient in trying circumstances, we are all fated to make the most of the hand that we are dealt. And I do believe that there are strategies we can practice to help us cope and adapt to life's hardships more effectively. Much involves, I believe, in thinking in new ways about our circumstances. We cannot always alter bad things that befall us, but we can, I believe, alter the way we think about them. We can gain through our thought what we might call conceptual leverage on our emotions. This involves, I think, a matter of summoning the will. In the 1960s, when I was in an important formative stage of my life, it was, quote, in to, quote, go with the flow, so to speak. It meant taking a Zen type of approach and passively giving oneself over to the flux of events. This approach has its place, to be sure. But as I've gotten older, I've concluded that there is something romanticized about this strategy that undervalues asserting one's will to change things, including one's thoughts. Different circumstances in life call for different approaches and different strategies. So among the coping strategies I've tried to cultivate in these difficult times is deliberately turning away from investing myself in the news. I simply got to turn it off sometimes, by which I often feel bombarded and overwhelmed, and refocus my attention on smaller things. I try to invest myself in moments of beauty, whether it be tending to my flowers and plants, marveling at the hummingbirds that pay me a visit rarely, it's always a surprise, this time of year, or admiring the shafts of sunlight that peer through the forest in my backyard at changing angles each morning as the sun rises and the shadows grow more defined. Many city dwellers, some members of the New York Society whom I've spoken to, have gotten into the daily routine, and I think establishing routines in these times is important. The routine of simply taking walks, okay, going on strolls. And they've told me that they've noticed with pleasure and joy things in their very neighborhoods that they have never seen or appreciated before. These moments of refuge, I think, are necessary in hard times to rejuvenate the spirit, find calm amidst the storm, and build, therefore, our resilience. A second mindful approach is to try to avoid catastrophizing. It is easy to feel overwhelmed in these times, but it's useful to turn our thoughts to the notion that the pandemic, in fact, will come to an end. When it comes to politics, it's sustaining to know that we're not in it alone, and there are cadres of others, doers and activists, who feel as we do and are working hard for positive change. It is also good to know that our society has faced challenges similar to what we're going through. I'll speak about that a bit later, and has come out better for it. It is useful to imagine that what plagues us now, as all phenomena, are temporal and will pass, and to imagine ourselves 5 years down the road looking at 2020 through the rearview mirror. As humanists, we should have the faith that the future is always open, and the future will not necessarily be determined by the present. It is also useful to try to focus our thoughts on what it is we want, as opposed to what it is we fear. The older I become, the more I have become a behaviorist. What I mean is that I don't think that we alter our emotions, including our negative emotions, by attempting to think or reason our way out of them. Rather, I think the response to despair, fear, depression, and feelings of defeat is action. Sure, indulge your depression for a day or two, but after that, get off your duff and do something concrete, however small, and I bet you your mood will change for the better. No one of us is going to vanquish the pandemic single-handedly, or our broken economy, or racial injustice, or our political morass. But we can change our outlook by bringing food to a quarantined friend, or looking after someone who is in need, or participating in letter-writing campaigns to enhance voter registration or turnout. Again, my contention is that the best antidote to despair is action. And I believe that resilience is not gained through a personality overhaul, but by taking small concrete steps of thought and action. I think this is in fact how most psychological change actually occurs. There is much more that I could add, but perhaps the most important vehicle towards building our personal resilience is through strengthening our social bonds with others. Again, as I've grown older, I've come to appreciate more and more that we are in fact deep down social and communal beings. Karl Marx had a beautiful phrase that the quote, the self is an ensemble of social relations. The self is an ensemble of social relations. Perhaps that's a bit overstated, I think, but I think there's a great deal of truth in that. We gain strength from the social bond and our caring, supportive relations with other people. The pandemic makes this especially hard, but makes it all the more necessary. Speaking personally, I have my hard moments. I also have a wonderful circle of friends whom I'm fortunate to care for me, fortunately, and for whom I care for and about. And now in these times, I find myself overcoming hesitation and picking up the phone more frequently to share feelings, experiences, vulnerabilities, and needs. And the caring response I receive from friends is simply priceless. Caring friendship is the strongest resource I have to get through these dark days. We need each other, and leaning on others and giving in return is the most effective way to find our resilience and build our strength. Well, I want to move now from the personal to the political and the social. Just as we have resources on the individual level to build our strength, enable our resilience, and give us hope, so there are resources on the level of our society as a whole that can render society stronger and foster within us an optimistic outlook. The crises that we face that can lead to despair are very well known. I have briefly summarized the major ones, and there are, of course, many others. But my sense of hope about what lies ahead emerges from the notion that crisis can give rise to opportunity. A journalist whom I greatly respect, George Packer, who writes for The New Yorker and The Atlantic, has written a piece that will be published in next month's, that is October's Atlantic magazine, on how America may be at the cusp of what he calls a plastic moment. Plastic meaning mutable and flexible, changeable. That is a moment of flexibility and potentially radical change. But for this to happen, certain things, big things, need to come together. I should say that much of my talk from here on in has been inspired by the thought of George Packer. If there are reasons for despair, there are also powerful underlying reasons to hope. That is, realities that are waiting to be born, so to speak, that will radically change the American landscape. Hard to see, they don't appear so much on the surface, but they're there. What are they? If we are looking for optimism, here are some reasons. Consider the following, okay, quote, large majorities of Americans state that government should guarantee universal health care. A majority confirms that our government should do more to mitigate global warming, that the rich should pay higher taxes, that racial inequality is a significant problem, that workers should have the right to unionize, that immigrants are in fact good for the country, and that our federal government is plagued with corruption and needs to be cleansed. As George Packer notes, quote, these majorities have remained strong for years. The readiness, the demand for action is new, end quote. And then he says, quote, the brutal statistics that count the jobless, the hungry, evicted, sick, and dead have forced a rethinking of our political and social arrangements. The numbers are a daily provocation for change, for radical change. The crises of 2020 could become the catalytic agent of a national transformation, end quote. Of course, what stimulates the demand for action is a thoroughly corrupt, bigoted, inept president who has betrayed his promise to be a champion of ordinary Americans. In a reversal of political vectors, the very depths to which Trump has brought us may very well be the spark that ignites the changes that will first normalize and then begin to rebuild our society. And we should also find hope, as is well known, in the millennial generation, younger folk who suffer from blighted economic prospects, are more liberal and progressive in their political views than older generations. As witnessed in the outbreak of protests nationwide, they are now, in fact, willing, many of them, to put their commitments into action. The great problem, I think, the great problem I believe that underlies our current crises is an absence of solidarity, an absence of solidarity in American life. It underlies a lot of what ails us. Americans are famously individualistic, but that reality has reached extreme proportions with the fraying of the social fabric. We have become divided and tribalistic too readily with acrimony born of humiliation. I will say more about this a little later on, but here, paradoxically, the COVID-19 pandemic may result in progressive consequences. It is one phenomenon that, in fact, brings us together, as very few things do. If we are to protect our own health as individuals, then of course we must act to protect others. If we do not, then we elevate the presence of the disease in society as a whole, and thereby reciprocally increase the risk to our own individual lives. The virus illuminates our social nature and our incumbent social obligations more pervasively, I think, than anything could. It is not only a medical phenomenon, but an ethical one as well. Beyond that, the pandemic and the failure of our central government to respond forces upon us the questions, as Packer notes, quote, what am I in relation to my society, and what is the role of government, end quote. When it comes to rebuilding American society, I can't help but be partisan. Can't help it. The Democratic victory in November needs to be crushing, optimally taking both houses of Congress. If we are to mitigate the divisiveness in American society, then the federal government will have to act quickly. Will have to act quickly with a series of policies that give more protections to individuals and provide solid economic entitlements in the form of universal health care, paid family and medical leave, and paid sick days. Government will have to mandate much more from corporations, demanding interest in the welfare of their workers and local communities, and not merely their shareholders. We will need massive expenditures to end massive unemployment by creating millions of jobs in manufacturing, caregiving, education, infrastructure building, and repair and clean energy. In short, we will need a New Deal, which significantly strengthens the role of government in order to shift the social contract. And this is the conceptual notion that is absolutely essential, to shift the social contract and the burden of risk from individuals to the collective. That is, put the onus on government for the benefit of society as a whole, and not continue as a society in which the individual needs to fend for him or herself. Okay, I mean, European social welfare states are built on that philosophy, on that notion. We are not, but we need to move in that direction. Can this be done? I think it can. Well, Biden is no ideologue, and believe me, I'm not a strong fan of Joe Biden and his politics. While Biden is no ideologue, which may be a good thing in that it may help the Democrats from splitting among themselves, something which unfortunately they're all too good at, he has clearly been pushed further to the left, in great measure following where much of his constituency is going, and through amicably working out agreements with Bernie Sanders' constituency. Bernie, in this regard, has been a real mensch in terms of trying to bring his own followers together with Biden in the service of defeating Donald Trump and unifying the Democratic Party. According to George Packer, quote, this is a sizable quote, the scale of Biden, this is very interesting, I'm not sure many people are aware of this, the scale of Biden's agenda is breathtaking. At its center is a huge jobs program. A Biden administration would invest $2 trillion in infrastructure and clean energy. He proposes creating 3 million jobs in early education, childcare, and elderly care, sectors usually regarded as, quote, soft and neglected by presidential candidates, while raising their pay and status. Another $700 billion would go to stimulating demand and innovation in domestic manufacturing for a range of essential industries such as medical supplies, microelectronics, and artificial intelligence. Some $30 billion would go to minority-owned businesses as part of a larger effort to reduce the racial wealth gap. Biden, he goes on to say, is proposing industrial policy, massive targeted investment to restructure production for national goals, something that no president has openly embraced since the 1940s. His agenda would also give workers more power with paid family and medical leave, paid sick days, a public option for health care, and an easier path to organizing and joining unions. It would more than double the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, a bitter point of dispute between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders in 2016, now uncontroversial among Democrats. Free trade is hard to find on the agenda. For all Biden's history as a centrist, his economic program would put an end to decades of Democratic incrementalism. Democrats, he says, are united behind proposals that would go further in reducing inequality and remaking the social contract than any administration in modern memory has even attempted. After teams made up of Biden and Sanders advisors and allies hammered out a 110-page policy platform, Sanders said, quote, I think the compromise that they came up with, if implemented, will make Biden the most progressive president since FDR, end quote, end quote. I personally believe this is a very promising and hopeful endorsement. May it come to pass. If we are looking for signs of hope, it would serve us well, I think, to recall that there have been 3 periods of progressive reform in the 20th century, each in response to challenging and very dark periods. The first was the progressive era, I think the one closest to our current day. The first was the progressive era in which our ethical culture movement was very much a part in the earliest decades. And it was marked by path-breaking activism at all levels of society, from the grassroots, the cities, there were rural movements, all the way up to the White House and Theodore Roosevelt with his trust busting and so on and so forth. Ethical culture didn't all do this all alone. We were part of a much larger, grander tendency and movement known as the Progressive Era that lasted from the last 2 decades of the 19th century up to the First World War. The Progressive era took place, I'm saying, at all stratas of society and brought together elements of populism, left-wing populism, and socialism. It was directed primarily at restoring democracy in the Gilded Age of robber barons and industrialists. It fought against the evils wrought by the Industrial Revolution. It was committed to bringing down corporate power and fighting corruption. The Progressive era was committed to improving life in the cities, teeming with immigrants, crammed into slums, chained to sweatshops, and controlled by urban bosses. It championed the labor movement, in which, again, ethical culture was a major player. What it did not do, tragically and lamentably, was engage racial inclusion. But the Progressive era did turn masses of activists into better citizens. But the Progressive era also laid the groundwork. It laid the groundwork for the coming of the New Deal, which was born out of the deprivations and miseries of the Great Depression. The New Deal gave us Social Security, unemployment insurance, minimum wages, and collective bargaining rights for workers. But tragically, again, the New Deal left Jim Crow in place. However, it shifted the burden of basic survival. Again, it shifted the burden, I'm saying, of basic survival from the individual to the responsibility of the state and to government. Again, that's the conceptual change and functional change we need. And then we had the civil rights movement of the 1960s following the conservatism of the Eisenhower years. The movement produced a burst of government creativity during the Johnson administration, with the Civil Rights Act that finally ended Jim Crow, anti-poverty legislation, and Medicare. The Johnson administration, according to George Packer, quote, realized the most vigorous set of laws and actions for social justice in America since the 1930s, end quote. With the emergence of Nixon, and then especially Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, culminating in Donald Trump, a conservative ethos once again took hold, reasserting the primacy of individualism, hyper-individualism, and an individual now taken to an excessive degree with the fraying of the American fabric and the divisive political tribalism that has undercut a sense of American unity and solidarity. But in a Biden administration, we may be poised for another Johnson moment that will swing America back from an ethos of I to an ethic of, quote, we. It is this problem of restoring American unity and solidarity, again, that I think is our most challenging underlying problem. It's a problem of leadership, of moral vision, of establishing social cohesion. One very good thing is that there has been, I think, a moral awakening in America in the last several years. We can look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Sanders campaign that had a strong moral undertow, the Women's March following Trump's inauguration, the biggest protest in American history, and a multitude of anti-Trump resistance movements, demonstrations on behalf of immigrants, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the broad-based call for racial justice. All these manifestations, I think, have caused a shift in how a large number of Americans think and talk about politics. Yet these movements, which rightly give us hope, have yet to come together in the seats of power, which will dramatically and substantially change American society. What progressives and a Biden administration need to do is move beyond critique of our society to coalition building. I believe the centerpiece of a new administration is the need again to act quickly and commit itself to intelligent, large, and well-deployed economic programs that will address universal health care, childcare, unemployment, a Green New Deal that will benefit all working people, but especially the most disadvantaged. And we need progressive multiracial coalitions built around radical economic reform. I think that economic justice needs to be the centerpiece of a progressive agenda. And the left, I think, and I could get crucified in certain circles for saying this, the left, I think, needs to tone down somewhat its commitment to identity politics, which tends to divide rather than unite. This by no means entails forsaking a powerful commitment to racial justice, but it does entail conjoining the struggle for racial justice with the struggle for economic justice, which I think lies at the heart of societal and political change. It means merging the cultural left with a robust progressivism grounded in economic egalitarianism. I think that such large and powerful economic programs wherein people see and feel that government is working for them will not put an end to the divisions in American society, but I do believe they will serve to mitigate them considerably. But beyond it all, we need to reimagine what we want America to look like. We need a sense of national identity and civic faith to energize a renewal in America. And we need a powerful revival of the one great idea that can hold us together, and that is a faith in democracy. To do this may involve such things as making voting easier, ending gerrymandering, amending the Constitution to overturn Citizens United. Perhaps we need to have a national service program. And I do believe that we need a great deal of civic education in our schools, in the media, and in community organizations. As I noted earlier, the greatest vehicle to resilience is action. And to rebuild a resilient democracy, people need to be civic actors and not passive subjects. Democracy is as democracy does. Let me close by saying that ethical culture is on the right side of this vital effort. We are a progressive organization intimately committed to civic engagement and social justice. We believe in democracy, not merely as a formal mode of government, but essential to the lifestyle of a free people. In these difficult times of unprecedented national challenge, we must lend our voice to the struggle. We may be a small organization, but we must harness our role in ensuring a democratic future for our children, our grandchildren, and for all who inhabit this nation that still holds out great promise. We must build and rebuild America. And so I say, friends, let us enter the fray, not with despair, but with optimism and hope that the future still remains in our hands. Friends, as we enter this new season, we must move ahead with our feet planted solidly on the ground while keeping our eyes on the stars. Thank you very much, and I wish you well. Okay. May you be well and stay healthy.
Thank you, Joe.
You are very welcome, Richard.
Thank you for a wonderful, inspiring message for this morning.